Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you this morning to discuss the review of implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC, by Malaysia. I believe that our colleagues from the media were briefed about the review process. I can just say a few words about the spirit of this process, which is a constructive approach to identify the challenges, the gaps that countries may be facing, as well as some of the good practices, good lessons that countries can share, because corruption is a problem that affects all countries around the world, whether it's developed or developing, whether it's rich or poor. We have evidence that there is corruption in every single country around the world. Just last week, I think there was a piece in the media, in the BBC. I saw that there was a major study in the European Union about the extent of corruption. So just to say that it's an issue that affects all countries, and that is why countries got together to adopt a UN convention against corruption to deal with this problem that affects so many countries around the world, to come up with some common approaches, norms, and standards in dealing with this problem, and in creating more cooperation between countries in dealing with the issue, in helping countries also share with each other lessons, means of dealing with the problem, and tools for dealing with it, and also encourage cooperation and technical assistance. So it's with that spirit that the state parties to this convention created a review mechanism for this convention. And it's in that spirit that countries go through that review, and reports are produced which highlight both what countries have achieved, what are some of the good practices that they have adopted, as well as some of the challenges that they are facing and gaps that they are facing. To elaborate a bit more, the work that was done on the review of Malaysia, involving the two countries which were the peer reviewers, was facilitated by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the office that I represent, which is the custodian of this UN Convention Against Corruption. And like all the other country review reports, it identified a number of gaps, a number of areas that further work has to be done. It acknowledged that in some of these areas which were identified, there was already work underway to address these issues, which was good. But also, I think what's remarkable is that it did identify a good number of good practices in Malaysia in dealing with corruption by different institutions. Bear in mind that this review only covered half of the convention. Out of 4 substantive chapters in the convention, which cover the 4 main areas covered by it, namely prevention of corruption, criminalization and law enforcement, international cooperation, and asset recovery. The current phase, the current cycle of the review, which Malaysia underwent, only covered half of this convention, meaning the 2 chapters on criminalization and law enforcement, chapter 3, and the chapter on international cooperation, chapter 4. So the observations by these countries was only related to those two chapters. And there, as I said, they also identified a number of successes and good practices. Part of it related to some of the laws adopted, some of the reforms in place. Part of it related to some of the institutions that have been dealing with these issues, including the corruption courts, the 14 specialized anti-corruption courts, the institutional setup of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission and the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Academy. In some areas, the interagency collaboration. They highlighted the National Coordinating Committee to Counter Money Laundering, for instance, in that area. As well as some of the measures in place, some of the processes in place in terms of international cooperation. The clarity of information available to other countries who want to seek international cooperation from Malaysia in mutual legal assistance, in extradition. There were a number of different elements which were highlighted. There was also, this was the part that was observations by the peer reviewers, by experts from two countries who reviewed basically the implementation of Malaysia of the UN Convention Against Corruption. But also in the process of preparation of the review, my colleagues from the Secretariat of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime who were involved in the process observed some good practices, a number of good lessons in the way that the authorities engaged in the review process. The resources which were dedicated to this in terms of the human resources, good communication that was in place with the reviewers and with the Secretariat, the good preparation, which started early. I understand that the authorities started 1 year in advance, which is something that we really encourage to avoid delays, to make sure that everything is in place in time for these reviews to take place. The follow-up, effective follow-up to the request for more information from the reviewers, a very comprehensive and efficient agenda which was set up for the country visit that took place as part of the review, and the knowledgeable staff who were dedicated to answer questions related to this review. Of course, having said all of this, the purpose of these reviews primarily is to see where the gaps are, what more needs to be done. So what's essential in these reviews is to ensure that there is follow-up, that everything which is identified, all the issues which are identified in the review are followed up and action is taken by the governments under review. I understand that there has been already discussions in Malaysia and plans for these follow-ups, so we welcome that as well, and I think that's also a very positive step and a very essential step of this whole process, because the purpose of all of this kind of process, as I said, is to make sure that governments are continuously building up on their efforts to deal with this serious problem of corruption, and that the review brings some more dynamism in the way that they are dealing with this question. I think it's also important to start preparing for the next round of review, because very important questions, namely prevention of corruption and asset recovery, were not covered by this review. So I think it's also very important to be ready to start thinking about that part of the convention and see what's necessary, what are the gaps in dealing with those questions. I think perhaps I'll stop there, and I can come back to some of these questions, some of these issues, perhaps in questions and answers as well.
Sir, where can Malaysia improve regarding the particular chapters that wasn't reviewed this time around?
I think there were a number of issues which were identified in terms of some legal reforms that are needed. That's what due to the nature of the provisions which were under review, as I said, which were related to criminalization and law enforcement and international cooperation. A big number of gaps which are identified are some technical definitions, legal definitions of different types of corruption offenses. And so the reviewers in the report identified a number of areas where Malaysia could improve the legal definitions related to some of these corruption offenses, or it could expand in some of the areas or mainstream a number of different corruption offenses that are identified. Some of this, as I said, they observed that there's already efforts in place to address it. Some of it was also recommendations. I have to say, the convention has different types of obligations in it. Some are mandatory, some are optional requirements, some are basically for governments to consider whether they want to do it or not. So the reviewers, of course, provide also some recommendations, which is up to the government and policymakers to see if it's relevant to their context. So they did make some of these recommendations in terms of, as I said, a number of different corruption offenses. As an example, for instance, the illicit enrichment is included in the law in Malaysia, as I understand, but can only be invoked in case of a prior investigation. So if there is already an investigation going on, then the authorities could look into the question of illicit enrichment by officials, meaning that money that they may have acquired without any explanation of legitimate source of that money. So one of the recommendations was to consider eliminating the requirement for a prior investigation before an illicit enrichment case can be pursued. Now, again, this is related to one of those non-mandatory provisions of the convention. So it's we are aware that countries have a specific legal requirements or conditions. So it's at the end of the day up to the countries to look at their legal system and see whether this is something that would fit their legal system. But one such recommendation was given. Or similarly, trading in influence is another area where it does exist, I understand, in the Malaysian law to a certain extent, but there was a recommendation to provide more clarity on this offense and provide for greater legal certainty in case of real or supposed influence that some authorities, some people may have on authorities. Again, it's a bit technical, some of these recommendations, so I don't know whether that's all clear, but in some other areas related to criminalization, there were a number of recommendations, but also in international cooperation, there were a number of recommendations related to revision of some of the existing mutual legal assistance treaties to make sure that they are in line with the requirements of the convention. With the understanding that officials also stated that in all the future mutual legal assistance treaties do take into account the requirements of the convention. But yeah, I mean there were also recommendations related to notifying the UN Secretary General as it's required by the convention on who's the central authority, what's the acceptable language for mutual legal assistance, a number of other technical requirements of the convention, for instance, of making sure that if authorities cannot respond to a request, that they are not rejecting it completely, but they are postponing until further information is provided, or to hold consultations with requesting states prior to refusing or postponing the assistance, which is something that in practice may happen, but the law, for instance, on this area doesn't include it as a requirement. But some of these fine-tuning issues were recommended by the reviewers. As a reference to the kind of addressing the issue of replacement or dismissal of the chief commissioner, is to make sure that it doesn't pose a risk to the independence of the commissioner. That's indeed an important point, which in discussions I think it was understood that it needs to be addressed through a constitutional amendment. I understood also later, if I'm not mistaken, and my colleagues from MACC can correct me if I'm wrong, that the issue has been discussed, I think, and there has been a constitutional amendment proposed, but that's something for our colleagues to. But I think, yes, that's indeed, they looked at some of the elements that would ensure that the independence of the Commission won't be at risk in case of a dismissal or replacement. So I think it's quite good that the authorities have taken into account this recommendation, and there is a process now, apparently.
We have even gone further, our MACC, in that we are seeking for powers of prosecution. So, where else is this? In this draft of the report, this is different. So I mean, here we can see MACC being very proactive.
The power for prosecution is not a requirement for anti-corruption agencies. What the convention does require is that there are entity or entities, body or bodies, it can be more than one, who are in charge of law enforcement, who have independence from undue influence. So as long as that requirement is fulfilled, it could be a central anti-corruption commission, or it could be several different authorities, including the Attorney General chambers and so on. So, I mean, that is left to countries to decide how best they want to handle it. But the important point is to make sure that those agencies do have independence. In fact, a number of those elements related to independence of the commission, including the operation review panel, were also taken into account, and the fact that there is an operation review panel that looks at the cases to make sure that there are no delays without interfering with the work of the public prosecutors, but at the same time making sure that cases move forward. So these were also identified as some good practices. I have to also say that on the international cooperation part, the role of the MACC as an international training and assistance provider through capacity building, exchanges, exchange programs, training, overseas trainings, and so on was also recognized, which is also, I think, a good practice. There has been a proactive approach to creating these relationships with other agencies, working together with them to build capacities and to kind of strengthen their capacities both inside and internationally. And also there has been cases of direct cooperation between a number of different agencies, the MACC, the Malaysian Financial Intelligence Unit, FIU, and the Royal Malaysian Police, with foreign counterparts, which was recognized as a good point. One more issue that I didn't mention is that the country reports are basically it's at the discretion of the government under review whether they want to make it public or not. The executive summary of all the reports are made public through our website of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. That's part, which is usually a shorter document, is published through our website. But the country reports is up to the governments. We do encourage that. And we are very happy to also learn that the Malaysian authorities have decided to make their report public. So I understand that today this report will be launched to the public, and once we have the authorization also we will be posting it on our website. This is also something that we really encourage and we welcome, because it gives broader public, but also not only in the country but also abroad, internationally, to look at these reports. And I think it's quite good for governments to have this confidence of putting out these reports for use, for reference by the public. So that's also something that we do encourage. Already a number of countries in the region have done this, and I think this is a positive trend. We hope that this continues. There were references to the work of the academy, also under the, as I mentioned earlier, under the institutional setup of a number of institutions. The MACC, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Academy, and the Anti-Corruption Courts were deemed to constitute exemplary practices. Even though these are young institutions, I think they were seen as contributing to improved investigations and prosecutions of corruption cases, and the reviewers called for them to be further strengthened. So I think that's also a positive kind of assessment. I have to say that also one thing that I didn't mention earlier is that these reports, as I said, the whole purpose is to have a constructive approach. Certainly the methodology of these reviews specifically indicates that they should not create any ranking. The purpose is not to sanction. The purpose is to be constructive. But so in that sense, they do not do comparison between countries. They look at the situation in the countries, and hopefully in the next cycle, which would be in a few years, looking at the same chapters, if that happens, they will be able to look back and see how much progress there has been and so on. But at the same time, I think it's important not to take these positive kind of developments for granted, and to continue with the efforts. I think the very important part of this whole exercise, as I said earlier, is follow-up, is continued efforts, strengthening the institutions, building on the good practices, addressing the gaps, and making sure that that countries remain vigilant in the face of the problem of corruption, because the criminal networks, the kind of groups which are trying to undermine good governance are constantly working on new methods and new ways of doing this. So we have to also remain vigilant with constantly building on in terms of the capacities and the institutional setup for dealing with this question.
Recommendations by the review.
Yes, in fact, the issues like independence, as I said, to be clear, I mean, at the end of the day, all of this, the convention itself recognizes the principle of sovereignty of states. So at the very end of the day, it's up to each government, each state party to decide what they need to be doing. So it really cannot impose on what needs to be done. But it does highlight also some issues related to mandatory provisions of the convention. The example of, for instance, making sure the independence, that there is no gaps in the independence of MACC, is one such case. Now, the whole point of how the removal is or dismissal of the chief commissioner is organized is not something that's dealt with in detail in the convention. But it only says that you have to ensure independence. That independence is a mandatory requirement. So whatever recommendation comes in relation to that, you can say that that's something that it's quite important to ensure. That's have to make sure that it's actually in the laws here. Other examples include, for instance, they observed that transformed or converted property may not be liable to confiscation in Malaysia. That if some property proceeds of corruption offenses is transformed in its form and or converted to other forms of property, that has to be also liable to confiscation. Sometimes there may not be that clarity in the law, so they called for that clarity related to a mandatory requirement of the convention. Or they also had the same observation related to confiscation and forfeiture of instrumentalities, this time for use in corruption offenses, to make sure that the instruments of corruption crime are also subject to confiscation or forfeiture. Again, the law may not have been clear enough in that area, so they called for that kind of measure to be in place. Also, another example is all the offenses in the convention should be also predicate offense for money laundering. So they should be able to establish an underlying offense for money laundering kind of cases. So they also called for obstruction of justice to be included, for instance, as a predicate offense. So these are a few examples of some of those mandatory ones. As I said, some of them are technical kind of work. Some require just more clarity in the laws. Some may require some legal amendments. And all of this means that there should be an action plan to deal with this. I understand that there has been already some thoughts given into that, but our colleagues are in a better position to elaborate on the plans that they may have. So yeah, I mean there are certainly a range of different recommendations that at the end of the day, it's up to each state party to decide how they want to take these recommendations forward. But the purpose is certainly that there is some concrete action coming out of this review process.
Is it something that we can look forward, let's say, the recall and the regulatory influence and the Corrupted Organizations Act, that should help tackling the mafia in New York?
Yeah, you could actually. Yeah, I mean, we do one part of this exercise is about also identifying the places where you can see the good practices of other countries or technical assistance that may be required for dealing with some of these questions. And in doing that, of course, looking at the successful practices in law or practice of other countries is certainly very useful to do. Thing to do. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a question of really seeing whether those measures that were undertaken in the States, in the New York State back in the 1970s, correspond to the legal environment and culture of Malaysia or not, or how they could be adapted to respond to your needs in these areas. But yeah, there are different models that are undertaken in terms of forfeiture in US, in Italy, in terms of confiscation of both proceeds and instrumentalities of crime, and using it in other areas, in for instance, contributing to work of civil society dealing with these issues and so on. So all of these models are areas that you can look at. We do not prescribe any specific model. As I said, each country has different requirements and environment, but certainly we encourage that exchange and that kind of broader exchange between countries to use the solutions that they may have come up with. So that definitely, I think, would be a positive step to look at a number of different models, including the one from New York State in 70s, and see which one is the most compatible for your system here. In the anti-corruption efforts, I assume. I don't think that as I said, the purpose of this review is not to present or to compare countries with each other. To answer that question would inevitably include an element of comparison. So I wouldn't put it that way. I think overall, I think a good number of successes and good practices are recognized in the review report, but also a number of challenges have been recognized. At the end, the purpose is not to come out with a judgment, and that's, I think, the key element here. So the purpose is not to come out with a judgment of countries, but I think to highlight some good elements and some of the challenges, and to provide a measure for the country to measure its own success in the future, to look back a few years from now and see where you in 2013 when this report was done. And for instance, if in 2018 the next phase of this review is repeated, to look back and see where are you at that time, what have you achieved. It helps establish some baselines and benchmarks. I mean, you are asked as part of this review to provide information on the number of cases, not only on the laws in place, but also on statistics and so on. So I think a few years from now, it would be a chance to look back and see how much progress has been achieved. So the main purpose, I think, is to have reflections internally and to measure the future progress, hopefully, in this area. In fact, yes, that's an important reminder. The country is part of, I think, the purpose of making this review process a truly participatory one is that all countries which are state parties to the convention have to be reviewed once under each cycle, which already happened for Malaysia by 2 peer reviewers. But also every single country has to be at least once reviewer of another country. So it's part of that really truly creating that peer review system, meaning that countries review each other. No two countries would be reviewing each other, though. I mean, it never. The way it works is that you are always reviewing some other country, and the third country is reviewing you. So there is no chance of two countries being, doing the mutual reviews, because that would defeat the purpose, perhaps. But still, the purpose is to make sure that every single country does engage in other reviews, at least once in another review. In case of Malaysia, I think Malaysia has been selected 3 times for review of other countries. Malaysia could have, that's a high number. They could have requested that they be exempted from additional reviews after the perhaps first and second one, the third one, but the authorities decided to actually contribute to all these 3 reviews. So they have been engaged in review of Iraq in the past, and I understand that there are ongoing reviews of Palau and Turkey. So that's, as I said again, part of the whole system of making sure that countries are all fully engaged, not only as a country under review, but also as reviewers of other countries. No, thank you very much for your interest in the subject. We understand that sometimes the subjects which are discussed in the report may not be very media friendly. There are lots of technical issues related to the convention, legal definitions or legal institutions or establishments, but hopefully we really do encourage the engagement of all different stakeholders in the efforts to implement the convention. The media has a very important role in working in the area of anti-corruption, not only through investigative journalism, but also through informing the public, in educating the public. So I think it's very good for the media to be interested also in this review process. Again, I think there is a lot of positive developments which are recognized in this review. There are also a number of improvements which are required, and I think we hope that with the level of interest by the government and by the broader public and the media in Malaysia, that these efforts will continue. There will be a continuous, basically, range of actions to deal with the problem of corruption, which, as I said, affects all of us, and increasingly has also a transnational dimension to it. So it requires really cooperation of all countries and societies within the countries and with each other. Thank you.